At 74 years old, Margaret Thorne stood in a sterile hospital hallway while her 4 children whispered about her deteriorating mental state. But what those greedy heirs didn't know was that a mother's memory is a vault they couldn't pick. They thought they had buried her alive in a diagnosis. They were actually digging the grave for their own lies. If you've ever felt the sting of being dismissed by the very people you raised, if you've watched someone smile while they stole your dignity, or if you've prayed for the truth to finally speak in a room full of liars, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Margaret found behind the cold stones of a root cellar will prove that divine justice never gets the address wrong. Stay with us until the end to see the moment the masks finally fell. Margaret gripped the heavy brass lion paperweight inside her coat pocket. The metal was cold against her palm. She had spent 40 years building a life that her children were now dismantling in 20 minutes. David, her oldest, stood by the window. He checked his gold watch. He looked at the doctor and then at his mother as if she were a broken appliance. "It's for the best, Mom," he said with a practiced softness. His voice sounded like a brochure for a high-end nursing home. Margaret didn't answer. She remembered the day she sold her grandmother's pearl necklace. She used the money to pay for his final year of law school. She had told him the money came from a library bonus. He had never asked why she stopped wearing the pearls. For 4 decades, Margaret had been the quiet engine of the Thorne family. She worked as a head librarian from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. She came home and cooked dinners that everyone took for granted. She spent her weekends sewing costumes for school plays. She spent her nights proofreading term papers. When her daughter Claire wanted a wedding in the south of France, Margaret took out a second mortgage. She told Claire it was a gift from her late father's hidden savings. Margaret spent the next 5 years eating soup for dinner to make the payments. She never complained. She believed that a mother's love was a debt that didn't need to be repaid. Her children saw her sacrifice as a natural resource to be mined. They grew up and moved into glass-walled offices. They forgot the woman who put them there. They only remembered her when the family estate became a topic of conversation. The Victorian mansion was worth $4 million. The investments were worth even more. Suddenly, Margaret's habit of misplacing her reading glasses became concerning cognitive decline. A forgotten grocery list became dangerous memory loss. They had been planning this for months. They brought in a doctor who seemed to have already reached a conclusion. Now, they stood in this white hallway. The air smelled of floor wax and old medicine. Claire adjusted her silk scarf and looked at her phone. She didn't look at her mother. "We just want you to be safe, Margaret," she said. She used her mother's first name to show who was in charge. The doctor held a clipboard with a stack of papers. These were the medical records that said Margaret could no longer care for herself. They said she was a danger to her own well-being. Margaret knew the words were lies. She knew her mind was as sharp as a new book. But the law doesn't listen to a woman labeled unreliable by her own blood. She felt the weight of the brass lion in her pocket. It was the only thing she managed to grab before David moved her out. He said the house was being prepared for sale to cover her medical expenses. He handed her a single cardboard box. Inside were her old library stamps and a few photos. He told her she wouldn't need much where she was going. He smiled when he said it. That smile stayed with Margaret as the doctor signed the order. She was 74 years old. For the first time in her life, she had no home. She was a ward of the state. She was a problem that had been solved. The children left together in David's black sedan. They didn't look back at the hospital entrance. They were already talking about the real estate agent. Margaret watched them go from the narrow window of her room. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. She sat on the edge of the hard bed. She pulled the brass lion from her pocket. She placed it on the bedside table. It looked small in the vast white room, but the lion was strong. It didn't break. Neither would she. She would wait. She would watch. And she would remember every word they said. Margaret Thorne was 74 years old when she realized that her life's work was being treated like a clutter to be cleared. Before the hospital hallways and the legal documents, she was the anchor of the Thorne family. She had spent 38 years as the head librarian of the county archives. Her desk was made of heavy oak that smelled of linseed oil and history. On that desk sat the brass lion paperweight. It was a gift from her own father when she graduated from university. The lion was heavy and solid. It held down the tall stacks of census records and land deeds that Margaret managed with precision. She loved the weight of it in her hand. It felt like a promise that some things never change. Her daily life was a rhythm of service that no one else seemed to notice. She woke at 5 in the morning to ensure the house was warm before the children woke up. She ironed David's shirts until the collars were sharp enough to cut paper. She packed lunches with handwritten notes that her children stopped reading by the time they reached middle school. Margaret didn't mind. She believed she was building a foundation for them. She believed that if she gave them everything, they would never know the hunger she had felt as a child. She had been the daughter of a tenant farmer. She knew what it was like to watch the rain and wonder if the roof would hold. She trusted her children because she had fashioned them from her own ribs. She remembered a specific Tuesday. In 1994, David had been accepted to a prestigious law school, but the tuition was more than the family had in the bank. Margaret had gone to the local jeweler that afternoon. She carried her mother's sapphire engagement ring in a velvet pouch. It was the only piece of jewelry she truly loved. She sold it for $3,000. She told the family she had won a grant for her work at the library. David had cheered and hugged her. He never noticed her bare finger after that day. The sacrifices were quiet and constant. When the library offered her a promotion to the state archives, she turned it down. The new job would have required a long commute. It would have meant she wasn't home to cook the Sunday roast. She stayed in the small county branch instead. She watched younger librarians move past her into higher salaries. She stayed for the sake of the family dinner table. She stayed because she thought she was buying their loyalty with her time. She didn't realize she was actually teaching them that her needs didn't exist. She was a ghost in her own kitchen. In those years, her children saw her as a fixture of the house. She was as reliable as the furnace and twice as quiet. They grew up and left for the city. They returned for holidays and expected the same roasts and the same ironed sheets. They never asked how her back felt after a day of shelving books. They never asked about the library. They only talked about their own lives and their own growing ambitions. Margaret listened. She smiled. She held the brass lion in her pocket during family dinners. It was her secret strength. It was the only thing that belonged entirely to her. She remembered the way the house felt before the silence set in. It was full of the smells of baking bread and the sound of children's laughter. She had documented every milestone in leather-bound journals. She recorded David's first steps and Claire's first word. She kept every drawing they ever made in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She thought she was preserving their history. She didn't know she was documenting the people who would eventually turn against her. She didn't know that love could be a one-way street until the street ended at a cliff. The change started slowly. It began with small comments about her memory. David would ask if she had taken her medicine when she hadn't even been prescribed any. Claire would move things in the kitchen and then claim Margaret had misplaced them. They were building a case against her in the shadows. They were using the very care she had given them as a weapon. They told her she looked tired. They told her she sounded confused. They used the language of love to construct a cage. Margaret felt the cold iron of that cage long before the door finally slammed shut. The library was quiet. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that cut across the mahogany table. Margaret sat in her usual velvet armchair. She looked at the fireplace she had cleaned every winter for 40 years. David set his leather briefcase on the table. He didn't look at the small scratches on the wood from when he was a child. He looked at the legal documents inside. Claire stood by the window. She held her phone up and took a photo of the oil painting of their father. She didn't ask Margaret if she wanted to keep it. She didn't even look at her mother. "That will fetch a high price at the auction next month," Claire whispered to her phone. She was already typing a caption. Margaret felt like a ghost watching her own funeral. David cleared his throat. He used his professional lawyer voice. It was the voice he used for clients who were about to lose a settlement. He didn't call her Mum. He called her Margaret. He said it was for clarity. "We've had a meeting with the specialists," David said. He slid a folder toward her. "We're worried about you, Mum. At your age, you can't manage a house of this size alone." Claire nodded without looking away from her screen. "We're just being realistic," she added. "This is what's best for everyone involved." She moved to the bookshelf and started scanning the titles. She pulled a first edition Dickens from the shelf and checked the spine. She didn't put it back. She set it on a stack of things to be packed. Margaret reached for her tea. Her hand was steady, but as her fingers neared the cup, David reached out. He picked up a marble coaster and slid it under her tea. He did it with a tight, practiced smile. "We don't want to ruin the finish on the mahogany before the showing, Mum," he said. The action felt like a slap. She had polished that table for 4 decades. She had survived their spills and their science projects. Now, she was a guest who couldn't be trusted with the furniture. "I paid for this house with my own inheritance," Margaret said. Her voice was thin but clear. "I worked at the library so you four could have everything." David didn't blink. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a fountain pen. "And we appreciate that," he said. "But you should have planned your retirement better, Mom. This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead. The math just doesn't work anymore." He leaned forward. His eyes were cold. "You're not getting nothing," David said. He pointed to a single sheet of paper at the bottom of the stack. "You're getting a property." He said the word as if it were a grand gift. Claire finally looked over. She smiled a small, sharp smile. "It's a clean break, Eleanor," she said. She used Margaret's middle name by mistake. She didn't even correct herself. "The hillside is yours. It's what you always said you wanted. Peace and quiet." Margaret looked at the paper. It was a deed for a small plot on the northern edge of the county. It was land they had forgotten about decades ago. It held nothing but a stone root cellar built into the side of a hill. It was a storage hole for potatoes and onions. It had no running water. It had no heat. It was where things were sent to be forgotten. The Victorian house to David and Stephen, the investment portfolio to Claire and Sarah. The life insurance proceeds to the four of them. While they exchanged victorious glances and checked their watches, Margaret received what they called her rightful portion, a rusted iron key and a deed to a stone cellar in the woods. "We're not being cruel," David said as he snapped his briefcase shut. "We're being practical. You'll be so much more comfortable in a smaller space that you can actually maintain." He stood up and checked his gold watch. He had a dinner reservation at 6. He didn't ask where she would sleep tonight. He didn't ask how she would get to the hillside. He just stood there, waiting for her to leave the room. Claire was already in the hallway. She was carrying the Dickens book and a silver vase. "I'll drop these at the appraiser on my way home," she shouted. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't say she loved her. She just walked out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut. The sound echoed through the empty house. Margaret sat in the silence. She looked at the marble coaster David had placed under her tea. She reached into her pocket. She felt the heavy weight of the brass lion paperweight. It was cold against her palm. She didn't cry. She didn't scream at the ceiling. She didn't beg them to change their minds. She knew exactly who they were now. She knew that the foundation she had built for them was made of sand, but her own foundation was made of something else. "I understand," Margaret said to the empty room. She stood up slowly. Her knees ached. Her back was stiff from years of shelving books. She picked up the iron key from the table. She didn't touch the tea. She didn't take any of the photos from the walls. They were photos of people she no longer recognized. She walked toward the door. She felt the brass lion in her pocket. It was the only thing she truly owned. She didn't look back. Margaret stood on the sidewalk with a single suitcase at her feet. The wind caught the hem of her coat and pulled at her silver hair. Behind her, the Victorian house sat silent and dark. David had changed the locks before she even reached the driveway. The porch light did not flicker. No one watched from the window to see if she made it to the curb. She was 74 years old, and she was standing on a public street with everything she owned in a scuffed leather bag. She reached into her small coin purse and pulled out the crumpled bills. She counted them slowly. There were $12.84. That was the total sum of her liquid assets. The bank accounts she had managed for decades were now under David's name as her legal conservator. She had $12.84 in the world. It was not enough for a hotel room. It was not enough for a meal and a taxi. It was barely enough for a bus ticket to the county line. She pulled her phone from her pocket and looked at the screen. The glass was cracked across the middle. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from Claire or Stephen. There were no voicemails from the grandchildren she had babysat every Saturday for 10 years. The only notification on the screen was a calendar alert. It reminded her that today was the day she was supposed to bake bread for the local library fundraiser. She cleared the notification. The screen went black. The silence of the phone was a physical weight. She looked up and down the street. The neighbors' houses were glowing with warm yellow light. She saw shadows moving behind curtains. She saw a family sitting down to dinner in the house across the street. No one came outside. No one asked if she needed a place to stay. To the neighborhood, she was the woman the doctors said was losing her mind. People don't open their doors to a woman who is officially labeled as a danger to herself. She felt the brass lion paperweight in her right pocket. She wrapped her fingers around its cool, heavy body. She felt the sharp edges of its mane. It was the only object in the world that knew her history. It had sat on her desk through 40 years of research and 12 years of widowhood. It had watched her children grow from toddlers into strangers. Now, it was the only weight keeping her grounded. She squeezed the metal until her knuckles turned white. She began to walk toward the bus stop at the corner. Her knees clicked with every step. Her lower back sent a sharp, hot needle of pain down her left leg. She ignored it. She thought about the map in her head. She knew where the hillside was. It was a 4-mile walk from the last bus stop on the edge of the county. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees. The air was turning damp and sharp with the smell of coming rain. She didn't call a friend. She didn't call the police. She knew that any call for help would only prove her children's point. They wanted her to panic. They wanted her to break down in public so they could lock her away permanently. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would go to the only place where she still held a legal title. She would go to the hole in the ground they had given her to humiliate her. The bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes. Margaret climbed the steps one at a time. She dropped $3 into the machine. She sat in the back of the bus near the heater. The warmth didn't reach her bones. She watched the city lights fade into the dark shapes of trees and fields. She held her suitcase on her lap. She felt the brass lion in her pocket. It was the only friend she had left. She was still here. The bus driver called out the final stop at the edge of the county line. Margaret Thorne, 74 years old, stepped down into the dark. The bus pulled away, its red tail lights disappearing into the mist like twin embers. The road ahead was unlit and narrow. To her left was a gas station with 2 rusted pumps and a general store with a faded blue awning that flapped in the rising wind. A single bulb flickered above the door. Margaret adjusted her grip on her suitcase. She felt the heavy brass lion in her pocket. It was a cold weight against her thigh. She walked toward the store. The gravel crunched under her sensible loafers. Her knees were stiff from the long ride. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She pushed the door open. A bell chimed softly. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and peppermint. Behind the counter sat a man with silver hair and a flannel shirt. He was cleaning a glass jar. He looked up and stopped mid-motion. He didn't ask if she was lost. He didn't ask for her name. He simply set the jar down and leaned forward. "You're Margaret," he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret paused. She had never been to this part of the county. She had never seen this man before. "I'm Frank," he continued. He pointed to a framed photograph on the wall behind him. It was a picture of the local volunteer fire department from 30 years ago. In the center stood Margaret's late husband, Arthur. He was smiling. "Arthur told us you'd come eventually after he passed. He said you'd know when it was time for the hillside." Margaret felt her breath catch. She looked at the photo. Arthur had never mentioned this store. He had never mentioned Frank. But the man spoke with a certainty that reached through her exhaustion. Frank reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. He set it on the wood. "The cellar is half a mile up the ridge," he said. "It's been a wet spring. You'll need this." Margaret reached into her purse for her remaining $9. Frank shook his head. "Arthur already paid the tab," he said quietly, "a long time ago." She left the store with the blanket draped over her suitcase. The rain began as she started up the ridge. It wasn't a soft mist anymore. It was a cold, driving downpour that soaked through her wool coat in minutes. The wind whipped her silver hair across her face. She followed a narrow path of packed dirt. Her shoes slipped on the mud. She fell once, her knee striking a sharp stone. She didn't cry out. She gripped the brass lion in her pocket and pulled herself up. She thought, "I am 74 years old, and I am walking into the woods, because my children decided I am trash." The path ended at a jagged limestone cliff. Built directly into the base of the hill was a heavy oak door, reinforced with iron bands. It was nearly hidden by a curtain of dead vines and creeping ivy. This was the root cellar. David had described it as a storage hole. He had laughed when he handed her the key. He had told her it was a place for things that no longer had a purpose. Margaret stood before the door. The rain ran down her neck. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely fit the rusted key into the lock. The iron was cold. The lock groaned as the tumblers moved. The door was heavy. It resisted her at first, sticking against the frames. She put her shoulder into the wood. She pushed with everything she had left. The door gave way with a low, scraping sound. A waft of cold, damp air hit her face. It smelled of wet earth and ancient stone. There was no light inside. She stepped over the threshold. The floor was packed dirt and flat river stones. The walls were thick blocks of granite that seemed to hum with the weight of the hill above them. She pulled a small flashlight from her suitcase. The beam cut through the darkness. The cellar was one large room, perhaps 12 feet square. There were wooden shelves along the back wall, most of them rotted through. A small iron stove sat in the corner, its pipe disappearing into the stone. There was a single wooden chair with a broken slat. This was the property she had been given. This was the clean break Claire had promised. It was a tomb made of rocks. Margaret set her suitcase on the chair. She took the brass lion out of her pocket. She placed it on a relatively sturdy shelf. The lion looked out into the shadows. The rain hammered against the thick door. The sound was muffled by the earth. She was alone. She was cold. She had $8.42 left in the world. She wrapped Frank's wool blanket around her shoulders and sat on the floor with her back against the granite wall. The door clicked shut. The morning light was a grey sliver that barely reached the floor of the root cellar. Margaret Thorne, 74 years old, woke with her back pressed against the cold granite wall. Her fingers were locked into stiff, painful claws from the dampness. She tried to straighten her legs, but her left knee was swollen and hot to the touch. The pain was a sharp, focused needle that stayed even when she stopped moving. She didn't have a bed. She didn't have a blanket other than the one Frank had given her. She had a stone floor and a broken chair. She stood up slowly. She used the wall for balance. Every movement was a calculation of effort against pain. She looked at her hands. The skin was thin and blue in the dim light. She thought about the lotion she used to keep on her nightstand in the Victorian house. She thought about the heated mattress pad that David had bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. He had said he wanted her to be comfortable. He had used her own money to buy it. Now, she was sleeping on river stones. She began a routine, because a routine was the only thing that kept the silence from becoming a weight. She used a flat piece of slate to scrape the mud from the floor. She found a rusted bucket in the corner and used it to catch the water dripping from a crack in the ceiling. She took the brass lion paperweight and used its heavy base to hammer the loose slats of the chair back into place. It was a librarian's work. She was organizing a space that had been abandoned for half a century. She was making a home out of a hole. Frank arrived at noon. The sound of his truck engine echoed off the hillside before he appeared. He didn't knock. He pushed the heavy door open and set a box of split oak logs on the floor. He brought a small bag of potatoes and a tin of coffee. He didn't ask how she was doing. He didn't look at her swollen knee. He looked at the iron stove in the corner. He spent an hour cleaning the flue with a long wire brush. He started a fire. The smell of wood smoke began to push back the scent of mold. Arthur always said this place was built better than the main house, Frank said. He stood by the door, wiping soot from his hands. He spent 3 summers hauling these granite blocks up from the creek. He said a house is for show, but a cellar is for surviving. He left a small kerosene lamp on the shelf next to the brass lion. He didn't wait for her to thank him. He drove away before the sun hit the treetops. Margaret sat by the small fire. She pulled her phone from her pocket. The battery was at 4%. She looked at the screen. 0 missed calls, 0 text messages. The last communication was an automated alert from her bank. It informed her that her primary checking account had been closed. The balance had been transferred to a trust managed by David Thorne. She had $5.12 left in her coat pocket. She thought, I cannot buy coal for this stove. I am 74 years old, and I cannot afford to fill a prescription for the pain in my knee. The math of the winter was too large to look at directly. The silence of the woods felt like it was moving in closer. She looked at the iron door. She thought about walking back to the road. She thought about calling David and telling him she would sign anything if he just gave her a bed. She thought about stopping. She looked at the brass lion on the shelf. The firelight caught the metal and made the lion's eyes look like they were glowing. It sat there, heavy and unmoving. It had survived the move. It had survived the betrayal. It was still a lion. Margaret reached out and touched the mane. Her hand was shaking, but she didn't pull away. She thought about David's gold watch. She thought about Claire's silk scarf. She thought about the way they had looked at her as if she were already dead. I am not dying in this hole, Margaret said aloud. Her voice was cracked and thin, but it filled the small room. I am not dying because you decided I was a line item on a ledger. I am 74 years old, and I am still Margaret Thorne. She stood up. The pain in her knee was still there, but she ignored it. She picked up the rusted bucket. She went back out into the rain to find more wood. She was not done. The storm hit at midnight. The wind shrieked against the hillside and pushed sheets of rain through the gaps in the iron door. Inside the cellar, the temperature dropped until Margaret's breath came in, white plumes. A thin stream of water began to flow down the back wall. It moved across the granite blocks and pooled near her suitcase. Margaret stood up. She reached for the kerosene lamp Frank had left. The light flickered as she moved toward the leak. The water was coming from a joint between two of the largest stones. She looked for something to plug the gap. She had no mortar and no tools. She reached for the shelf and grabbed the brass lion paperweight. Its heavy base was the only solid thing she had. She pressed the lion's mane against the wet stone. She tried to wedge the metal into the crack to divert the flow. As she pushed, the granite block didn't just hold the weight. It shifted. The stone moved inward with a grinding sound that echoed through the small room. Margaret froze. She held her breath. She thought the wall was collapsing. She stepped back, the lamp trembling in her left hand. The stone had recessed 3 inches into the wall. It wasn't a structural failure. It was a mechanism. She reached out and pushed again. The block slid back further, revealing a hollow cavity behind the granite. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The sound of it was louder than the rain. Inside the dark space sat a rectangular metal box. It was the size of a boot crate and sealed with a heavy wax coating. Margaret reached into the hole. The metal was cold and slick. She pulled the box out and set it on the floor. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to set the lamp down. She knelt on the river stones. She used the sharp edge of the brass lion to scrape away the wax seal. The lid groaned. It resisted her. She spoke to the empty room. "What did you hide, Arthur?" she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. The lid finally popped open. Inside was a stack of manila folders wrapped in heavy plastic. Margaret Thorne pulled the first folder out. She unfolded the plastic. The first page was a medical evaluation. She recognized the letterhead of the Thorne family clinic. She saw the name of Dr. Miller, their family physician for 30 years. She read the date. It was from 14 months ago. She read the summary line at the bottom of the page. Patient shows 0 signs of cognitive impairment or memory loss. Results of the neuropsychological exam are in the 99th percentile for her age group. Margaret read the sentence again. She read it a 3rd time. This was not the report David had shown the court. The report in the hospital hallway had said she was delusional. It had said her brain was shrinking. She looked at the signature. It was Dr. Miller's original ink. She turned the page. Attached to the back was a handwritten note from her son, David. It was on his law firm's stationery. "Dr. Miller, we cannot use this version. My mother is clearly not herself. Please adjust the findings to reflect the concerns we discussed. I have enclosed the additional consulting fee." Margaret's vision blurred. She had to close her eyes for a moment. She felt the cold floor through her thin trousers. She reached back into the box. She pulled out a second document. This one was titled Plan of Distribution. It was not a legal deed. It was a private agreement. It was dated 2 years ago. It bore the signatures of all 4 of her children: David, Claire, Stephen, Sarah. She read the terms. They had divided the Victorian house, the library pension, and the investment accounts into 4 equal shares. They had done this while she was still cooking their Sunday roasts. They had signed away her life while she was still buying their birthday gifts. The final clause was underlined in red ink. It stated that the hillside property would be used as the final legal residence to ensure the mother had no standing to challenge the estate. The betrayal was a map. They had drawn it years ago. They had waited for her to trip so they could claim she was falling. Margaret held the paper under the lamp. She looked at Claire's signature. She remembered Claire asking for that second mortgage for the wedding. Claire had signed this document only 3 months after the wedding ended. She looked at David's signature. He had signed it the same week he told her how much he admired her strength. She reached for the brass lion. She gripped it until the metal bit into her palm. She didn't cry. The time for tears had ended in that hospital hallway. She looked at the medical records. She looked at the check carbon for the consulting fee that had been tucked into the folder. Arthur had known. Somehow, her husband had seen the rot growing in his own children. He had hidden the evidence where only a woman who was truly desperate would find it. He had known they would leave her here. Margaret stood up slowly, The pain in her knee was still there, but it felt distant. It felt like something that belonged to a woman who was finished. She was not finished. She gathered the folders and placed them back in the plastic. She tucked them into her suitcase and locked the clasp. She picked up the brass lion and set it back on the shelf. The fire in the stove was dying, but she didn't feel the cold anymore. She knew exactly what to do. The next morning, the rain stopped, and the woods fell into a heavy, dripping silence. Margaret Thorne did not go to the road to find a phone. She did not walk to the bus stop. She walked down the ridge to the creek. The path was steep and slick with wet leaves. Her left knee clicked with every step. She felt the dull heat of the inflammation. She ignored it. She reached the water's edge and knelt on the mud. She began to fill her rusted bucket with sand and small, flat river stones. She hauled the first bucket up the hill. The weight pulled at her shoulder. Her lungs burned in the sharp morning air. She had to stop 3 times before she reached the iron door. She emptied the sand onto the dirt floor of the cellar. Then she went back down. She did this 10 times. By the 10th trip, her coat was soaked with sweat and her hands were trembling. She stood in the center of the cellar and looked at the pile of earth. She was 74 years old. She was doing the work of a laborer. She didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a builder. She used a flat piece of cedar to level the sand across the floor. She worked on her knees. She crawled from the back wall toward the door. She smoothed the surface until it was as even as a library table. Then she began to lay the river stones. She fit them together one by one. She looked for the shapes that matched. A jagged edge met a smooth curve. A gray stone met a white one. By the 3rd day, the floor was solid. The stones were cold and smooth under her feet. She found an old, stiff-bristled brush in the back of the cellar. She mixed wood ash from the stove with water to make a thick, caustic paste. She began to scrub the granite walls. She started at the ceiling and worked her way down. She pushed the brush into the deep crevices between the blocks. She scrubbed away 40 years of soot and spider webs. She scrubbed until the natural gray of the stone emerged from the dark. Frank returned on Thursday afternoon. He brought a gallon of white lime wash. He looked at the floor. He looked at the clean walls. He didn't ask why she was doing this. He didn't tell her she was too old for the work. He set a small wooden table near the stove. "Arthur always said you had a better eye for structure than he did," Frank said. He helped her apply the lime wash to the ceiling. The white liquid covered the dark beams. It reflected the light from the door. The cellar began to change. It was no longer a hole in the hill. It was a vault. Margaret found discarded cedar fence posts behind the general store. The wood was grayed by the sun. She carried them back to the ridge. She didn't have a saw. She used a heavy rock to break the wood into lengths that fit the rotted shelf brackets. She used the brass lion paperweight to hammer the rusted nails into place. The metal of the lion grew warm in her hand. The sound of the strikes echoed off the granite. She traded her gold wedding band to Frank for a small iron cot. The ring was the last piece of jewelry she owned. David had never noticed she still wore it. She didn't feel a sense of loss when she handed it over. The ring belonged to a woman who had spent 40 years waiting for her family to value her. The mattress belonged to a woman who had earned her own rest. She placed the cot against the northern wall. She covered it with the blanket. By the end of the 2nd week, the physical transformation was complete. The whitewashed ceiling made the room feel tall and airy. The lime reflected the light and pushed the shadows into the corners. She scrubbed the iron stove until the black metal shone. She polished the brass lion until she could see her own face in the curve of its flank. She looked at her reflection. Her silver hair was tied back in a practical knot. Her face was lined. Her hands were covered in hard, yellow calluses. The beauty of the room wasn't in the furniture. It was in the light. In the late afternoon, the sun hit the western side of the ridge. The light entered the cellar at a low angle. It hit the mica deposits in the cleaned granite walls. The stones didn't just reflect the light. They sparkled. The entire room filled with a soft golden glow that made the white ceiling look like silk. Margaret sat on her iron cot and watched the light. She reached into her suitcase. She pulled out the manila folders she had found behind the wall. She set them on the cedar shelf next to the brass lion. She wasn't hiding them. She was displaying them. They were the most important volumes in her library now. She looked at the iron door. She knew her children would come, eventually. They would come to see if the cold and the dark had broken her. They would come to ask for her signature one last time. She picked up the brass lion. It was heavy and solid. She placed it on top of the medical records. The lion stood guard over the truth. Margaret lay down on her mattress. She closed her eyes. The sound of the wind in the trees was the only noise. The morning sun hit the whitewashed ceiling of the root cellar and turned the small room into a chamber of pale gold. Margaret Thorne, 74 years old, sat on the edge of her iron cot and looked at her hands. The skin was no longer soft. The knuckles were thick. There was a deep, healing scratch across her left palm from a granite splinter. She rubbed her thumb over the callus. For 40 years, these hands had turned the pages of other people's stories. Now, they were writing her own in the grit and the stone. She stood and walked to the cedar shelf. She picked up the brass lion paperweight. It felt like a natural extension of her arm. She didn't think about the Victorian mansion anymore. She didn't think about the mahogany table or the silver vases. Those things were just shells that her children had inhabited until they outgrew them. She realized that she had been the librarian of their lives. She had catalogued their successes and filed away their failures. She had curated a family that didn't actually exist. She walked to the iron door and pushed it open. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. She sat on the flat stone step. She looked toward the ridge. "You knew, Arthur," she said quietly. Her voice was steady. "You knew they would stop seeing me the moment you weren't there to remind them. You didn't leave me a hole, you left me a fortress." She felt a sudden, sharp, physical sensation in her chest. It wasn't the tightness of grief, it was the expansion of breath. She was breathing air that didn't belong to a trust or an estate. The community began to arrive on the third Tuesday. It started with a young woman named Sarah. She was the daughter of the woman who ran the post office. Sarah walked up the ridge, carrying a stack of waterlogged ledgers from the 1920s. She had heard that the head librarian was living on the hill. She didn't ask about the children. She didn't offer a sympathetic look. She set the ledgers on the stone floor. "The basement flooded at the town hall," Sarah said. "Everyone said if anyone could save these, it would be you." Margaret didn't hesitate. She cleared her small wooden table. She spent the afternoon showing the girl how to separate the pages with silk thread. She explained the chemistry of the ink and the way the paper fibers expanded when wet. She wasn't a ward of the state. She was an expert. By the following Saturday, 2 more people had come up the ridge. A man brought an old family Bible with a broken spine. A teenager brought a map of the original county lines that had been folded into a knot. They didn't bring charity. They brought problems that required her mind. They paid her in firewood and jars of preserved peaches. They paid her in fresh eggs and thick wool socks. One man spent 3 hours fixing the seal on her iron stove. He didn't charge her a cent. He said he was paying back the time she had helped his mother find her birth records 40 years ago. The hillside was no longer a place of exile. It was becoming a destination. Margaret found herself standing taller. The pain in her knee was still a constant companion, but it no longer dictated her day. She moved with a deliberate, rhythmic grace. She stopped wearing the old fraying cardigan she had brought from the mansion. She wore a heavy canvas work jacket. Frank had traded her for a research project on his family genealogy. She looked in the small mirror she had hung by the door. Her silver hair was pulled back tight. Her eyes were sharp. She looked like a woman who had survived a shipwreck and decided she liked the island. She had exactly $17.60 in a jar on the shelf. It was more than she had arrived with. It was money she had earned with her own hands and her own knowledge. It was small, but it was absolute. She looked at the manila folders sitting under the brass lion. She knew that David and Claire would eventually hear about her. They would hear that their delusional mother was thriving in the hole they had dug for her. They would come to reclaim the narrative. She didn't fear them. She realized that their power was entirely based on her participation in their lies. She had spent years agreeing with them to keep the peace. She had accepted their version of her because she was afraid of the alternative. Now, the alternative was her home. She was 74 years old and she was finally her own primary source. She sat back on her cot and watched the shadows of the trees move across the stone floor. She felt a profound, quiet peace that didn't require anyone's permission. She was ready for the end of the story. The sound of a high-end engine echoed off the limestone cliffs on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret Thorne, 74 years old, was sitting at her cedar table. She was cataloguing a collection of local property deeds from 1890. She didn't look up when the black SUV pulled to a stop at the base of the ridge. She didn't move when the heavy iron door was pushed open without a knock. David stepped into the cellar first. His Italian leather loafers were immediately coated in the grey mud of the path. He didn't apologize. He looked at the whitewashed walls and the stone floor with a look of profound disgust. Claire followed him. She held a silk handkerchief to her nose. She looked at the iron cot and the small stove. "Mum, we've been so worried," she said. Her voice was high and tight. "We heard from the local authorities that you were residing here. It's even worse than we imagined." She didn't step further into the room. She stayed by the door as if the stone might stain her coat. David cleared his throat. He pulled a thick envelope from his breast pocket. He set it on Margaret's clean cedar table. "We're just being realistic, Mum," David said. He used his softest, most condescending lawyer voice. "At your age, you can't manage alone in a place like this. It's a liability for the family. We've found a much more suitable facility in the city. It has 24-hour care and a garden." He tapped the envelope. "We just need you to sign these final transfer papers." There was a small clerical error with the title of the main house. "Once this is settled, you'll be so much more comfortable there." Margaret looked at her son. She didn't see the boy she had ironed shirts for. She didn't see the student she had sold her mother's jewelry to support. She saw a man who was terrified of a title search. "You need my signature to close the sale on the Victorian house," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years maintaining silence in a library. David's eyes flickered toward Claire. "It's a formality, Mum. This is what's best for everyone." "I found the box, David," Margaret said. She reached for the brass lion paperweight. She moved it 2 inches to the left. Underneath sat the manila folders. "I found the medical records Dr. Miller refused to sign. I found the check carbon for the additional consulting fee you paid him to lie about my mind. And I found the plan of distribution you all signed 2 years ago." The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that exists in a room where a bomb has been placed but hasn't yet detonated. Claire's hand dropped from her face. Her mask of concern vanished. "You were always too nosy for your own good, Mother," she snapped. David held up a hand to quiet. His sister. He leaned over the table. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed. "You're 74 and living in a hole in the ground," he said. "No court is going to take the word of a woman who chose a root cellar over a professional care facility. You're clearly not capable of making decisions if you think this is a victory." "I agree," a new voice said from the shadows near the back wall. Dr. Elias Vance stepped into the light of the kerosene lamp. He was a tall man with a calm face and a clipboard. He had been sitting in the corner since before the SUV arrived. David froze. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. Dr. Vance didn't flinch. "I'm the court-appointed psychiatrist who reviewed your mother's original files last week," he said. "The files she found behind that stone wall. The files that match the ones I have in my bag. Your mother isn't delusional, Mr. Thorne, but your legal standing certainly is." David's face turned a deep, mottled red. He looked at the folders and then at the doctor. "This is a private family matter," he stammered. Margaret stood up. She didn't use the table for support. She stood on her own 2 feet. She was shorter than David, but she seemed to fill the room. "You gave me this property because you thought it was worthless," she said. "Because you thought I was worthless. You were wrong about both." She picked up the envelope David had placed on the table. She didn't open it. She handed it back to him. "I am not signing anything," Margaret said. "I own this hillside. I own the mineral rights to the limestone quarry that runs beneath it. And I own the evidence of your fraud. You can leave now. I have work to do." Claire began to shout something about inheritance, but David grabbed her arm. He looked at Dr. Vance and then at his mother. He saw the brass lion on the table. He saw the iron door. He realized for the first time that his mother was not a problem to be solved. She was a woman who had survived him. They left without another word. The sound of the SUV's tires spinning on the wet gravel was the only noise. Margaret stood in the center of her cellar. She looked at the stone floor she had laid with her own hands. She looked at the whitewashed ceiling. She felt the heavy weight of the brass lion in her pocket. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She was simply finished. The door clicked shut behind them. 1 year after the morning she arrived at the ridge, Margaret Thorne sat on her front step. The hillside was no longer a place of grey shadows and wet mud. Broad stone stairs now led down to a small gravel parking area. Wild roses climbed the granite walls of the root cellar. They bloomed in a shade of deep, defiant pink. Inside, the cellar was cool and dry. A new oak desk stood where the old cedar table had been. It held a computer and a professional scanner. Margaret spent her mornings digitizing the county records she had saved from the flood. She drew a steady salary from the Historical Society now. She wore a clean linen shirt, and her silver hair was pinned with a polished wooden comb. Her hands were steady as she moved the brass lion paperweight to the center of the desk. The lion looked out toward the open door. The sun caught the metal and made it glow like gold. It was the only item she had kept from her old life. It was enough. She didn't look at the mail that arrived from the city anymore. David's firm had collapsed under the weight of the fraud investigation. Claire had sent a 3-page letter asking for a loan to cover her legal fees. Margaret had recycled the paper to use for notes on a genealogy project. She stood up and walked to the edge of the ridge. She looked out over the valley where the trees were beginning to bud. She touched the warm stone wall of her fortress. "You were right about the foundation, Arthur," she whispered to the wind. "It's the only thing that doesn't age." She went back inside. Margaret Thorne's journey proves that the architecture of a soul is far more durable than the walls of a house. She showed that when the world tries to bury you, it often provides the very stones you need to build your own sanctuary. Her story is a reminder that dignity is not a gift given by others, but a resource found within the quietest corners of our own resilience. She stood against the cold and the dark and found that she was the light she had been waiting for all along. The truth survived because she refused to let it be silenced. Her children thought they were giving her a grave, but they actually gave her a foundation. If Margaret's story moved you, if you've ever felt the sharp edge of betrayal from those who should have protected you, leave one word in the comments describing the strength Margaret found in that cold cellar. Because Margaret's story proves something that is always true. The most dangerous person in the world is a woman who has nothing left to lose and the truth on her side. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their value is not determined by the people who fail to see it. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.